Welcome to this lunchtime lecture on gender and climate change. Why are women at more risk from global heating? My name is Karen Levy. I'm from the UCL Development Planning Unit, and I'll be chairing this lunchtime session, which is part of UCL's climate campaign, Generation One. The vision behind Generation One is that together we are the new generation taking responsibility for climate change and turning science into actionable ideas to contribute to creating a positive, fair, and progressive future. And you're very welcome to join the various activities of Generation One. It's very easy. At least let me just mention the two ways. You can pledge your climate action, which you can find out more about on the Generation One UCL website. And through pledging your action, hopefully inspire others to share through social media, through tweeting, etc. Please also check out the new Generation One podcasts, a really interesting podcast series, again on the UCL Generation One website. So for this session today on gender and climate change, why are women more at more risk from global heating? I'd like to welcome our three speakers for today, really interesting and provocative set of issues that they're going to raise for us today. Our first speaker will be Dr. Virginie Le Masson, who is one of the co-directors of the Center for Gender and Disaster within UCL's Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. Her research looks at gender inequalities and violence related to risks in places affected by environmental change and disasters. Our second speaker will be Dr. Priti Parikh. Priti heads the Engineering for International Development Center at the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction, which researches inclusive and sustainable infrastructure solutions in resource-challenged settings. And our third speaker is Dr. Jordana Ramalho, a lecturer in development planning for diversity at the Bartlett Development Planning Unit. And her research explores the sociospatial political ecologies of disaster risk management, resilience building, and urban development. Folks, we're going to have some time for questions at the end of the session, but do keep your questions rolling through the session. I think that really will help our speakers also perhaps sometimes respond directly to some of those questions. We're using Slido as a mechanism for channeling the questions. You can go there, connect in on sli.do and enter the event code hashtag UCL Climate. So folks, I'd like to pass over to our first speaker, Dr. Virginie Le Masson, whose presentation will discuss how violence against women and girls undermines their resilience to climate risk. Over to you, Virginie.
Thank you very much, Karen, for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to take part in this lunch series. Can I just check that you can see my slides, my screen? Yes. Okay, perfect. So normally I do an hour-long lecture on the intersection between climate change, gender inequalities, and health. But by way of introduction, I'm going to focus the next 15 minutes on trying to deconstruct a little bit the main question that was asked to us, the panel speakers. And I want to ask further, when we talk about women, what women do we refer to? I also want to further ask, who do we consider to compared to whom? And also what we mean by risk and global heating related risks. So these three questions are going to frame my 15-minute presentation. And starting with the first question, what women are we talking about? Here, I want to mention that most of the literature on gender and climate change has been predominantly focusing on the way and the experiences of women from the global south, the so-called global south, and how they're experiencing the environment and environmental shifts. This has been largely driven by the literature for the past 20 years, but also from the learning of non-governmental NGOs and the interventions that they are operating in places affected by climate change. On the one hand side, this has been useful to make visible the experiences of women, especially that their practical needs, their strategic interests tend to be overlooked by humanitarian and development actions. So this has been useful to target their interest a bit more and document also their experiences. We also know that in many parts of the world affected by recurring droughts, particularly in fragile states, female-headed households are likely to be considered food insecure as compared to male-headed households. And this has to do with lots of different coping mechanisms that are more available to men, such as migration, for example. Including in my own research, I can share many examples where taking a gender perspective helped to understand how people will be differently affected by similar environmental shifts. And one of the research projects that I'm involved in is funded by UKRI, and it's looking at the way seaweed farmers are coping with environmental shifts in 3 different countries, including Tanzania. And in Tanzania, we found that seaweed farmers are having to cope with a decrease of their yields due to the global warming of temperature. And this is increasing the likelihood of pests and pathogens to affect their seaweed crops. As a result, they have less seaweed production, and some of the coping mechanisms and strategies that could help them avoid those risks include, for example, moving their farms to deeper water where the water is cooler. But this strategy is unavailable for women because they have never been taught how to swim, for example, but also because they have fewer opportunities to access equipment such as boats compared to men. So this is just an example of how some people living in the same place may have different ways to deal with risk according to their social identities. But having said that, I also want to bring here a caveat in the fact that sometimes a gender perspective is not enough. And in similar places affected by similar risk, some communities will not have the same capacities to deal with risk. And here I want to bring the example of 2 very different communities living in the same place in the Western Cape in South Africa. And you probably have heard before that Cape Townians had to prepare for day 0. That was 3 years ago now. And I was living in Cape Town at the time, and they had to prepare for the day the city would cut water supply just because there was not enough water in the dams surrounding the city. But in facing those water restrictions, obviously some communities were not able to cope in the same ways, and others were far more affluent to deal with the stress. And this was largely influenced by other aspects than gender inequalities, particularly racial inequalities and the geographical segregation that still exists. So similar to unpacking a little bit what we mean by women, I want to also ask the question, who do we compare women to? Obviously, men can also be exposed and suffer from heat-related illnesses or heat risks, not just women. And it largely depends in which context, and also depending who do we include. It also raises this importance that it's not related necessarily to biological differences, but largely to occupations and gender roles. So when looking at the literature, particularly from what quantitative studies say around potentially this increased exposure of women to heat-related illness, I didn't find a consensus in the literature that suggests that this is the case. For example, one meta-analysis of the literature suggested that actually there was no concluding evidence that women may be more exposed to heat illnesses, but there is other research that suggests that it's actually the case, for example, with research in France related to 6 different heat waves between 1971 and 2003 that show that women were facing higher mortality ratios compared to men. Similar findings in Finland, where women, particularly the elderly above 75 years old, were more likely to die as a result from heat waves. But because we don't really have a consensus, and especially when looking at this quantitative study, they all suggested that there could be explanation related to people's roles and behaviors. This is where qualitative research is really important to give us a little bit of insight into understanding how people are differently affected by global warming. There is research in Australia following bushfires that suggests that men are more likely to die from bushfires, largely due to their tendency to stay behind to protect their houses and assets. And so this risk behavior tends to lead to higher mortality rates for men compared to women's. Similarly, in terms of mental health in relation to disasters, both genders are affected by increased mental health issues, but evidence suggests that men in particular are disproportionately likely to commit suicide following a disaster, with evidence from farmers in India. So to conclude on this point that I wanted to make, and you may be familiar with the gender unicorn, it's to suggest that gender does not equal women. And this has to be constantly reaffirmed because the binary between men and women is not helpful anymore to draw a nuanced picture on how climate change affects people differently. And an intersectional approach is really necessary, both to understand people's social identities in terms of their gender identities, gender expression, sexual orientation, beyond sex characteristics, but also the other social identities that will influence their vulnerability and capacities related to their age, their ethnic origins, class, etc., etc. The last point I wanted to make is to deconstruct a little bit what we mean by risks and global heating, especially. We have on the one side the scientific evidence on the future impact of climate change, and I'm referring here to the summary for policymakers of the latest IPCC report that came out this year. And what this report shows is that changes will include not only heat waves, but also an increase in the frequency of hot extremes, marine heat waves, heavy precipitation, and in some regions, agricultural and ecological droughts, but also an increase in the proportion of intense tropical cyclone, as well as reductions in Arctic sea ice, snow cover, and permafrost. So these will generate very different risks that will have very different impacts according to the regions, but also according to the vulnerability of societal settings exposed to these impacts. So this is the flip side of looking at the issue of gender and climate change. It's to move away from the focus on natural hazards and looking at the factors that make certain people more likely to suffer from climate change. And the particular aspect that I'm interested in is the impact of gender-based violence that occurs regardless of climate change. But it does, evidence suggests that it does increase in times of stress and disasters. So there is a lot of evidence, for example, from Australia and New Zealand that should suggest that men are likely to face frustration following droughts, bushfires, the loss of their livestock and their main livelihoods. And this is translating into backlash against their own family members, particularly domestic violence. And what research has shown, particularly from Deborah Parkinson, for example, in Australia, is that not only is domestic violence increasing during disasters such as bushfires, but also it's less likely to be reported in communities who do not want to hear about this hidden disaster. And in my own research, I've been trying to focus on this influence of violence against women and girls and the influence on their resilience capacities to deal with the other risks that they face on a daily basis. And one way to summarize this research, if I can, in one slide, is to emphasize that women and girls on average are the primary victims of intimate partner violence. And this has an effect on all aspects of their lives and well-being, from early pregnancies to domestic violence to suffering health consequences of female genital mutilation. And this influences the other aspects of their personal development, from lack of access to knowledge, school, lack of opportunities for income generation activities, lack of social justice and accountability, and so on and so forth. And all of these elements contribute to create societies and contexts that are less able to cope with the intersection of different risks, including climate change. And so the idea here is to recenter global heating, global warming, or climate change into a broader context of intersecting risk related to societal development pathways and often unsustainable pathways. So I will leave you with this. These are some of my references, and I look forward to hearing more about the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Virginie, for a really great start to this lunchtime session. Folks, I'm sure you have many, many questions after that presentation. Do remember, go to Slido, sli.do, enter the event code, #UCLClimate, and hopefully we're going to have some space at the end to pick up some of those questions. So I'd like to move on to our second speaker, Priti Parikh. Her presentation will look at how women bear the burden of lack of infrastructure and how climate change further exacerbates this inequality. So over to you, Priti.
So delighted to be here today. It's such a pleasure. I was privileged enough to represent UCL at COP26. And being trained as an engineer, a lot of thinking and research we do in my research center is around the implications of lack of infrastructure and the burden that presents, the lack of infrastructure presents to everyone, but in particular women. So that's going to be really the thrust or emphasis of my talk today, the intersection of climate change and infrastructure and how women really bear the burden of both. But before I do so, I wanted to set a bit of context. And this might be something well known to you or not, but there is a huge injustice or lack of equity, where the richest 10% of the population on this planet is responsible for almost half of the total lifestyle emissions. And vice versa, the poorest 50% of population is only responsible for 10% of lifestyle consumption emissions. And this is challenging and problematic because within the 50% of population, there will be a need to provide improved housing and infrastructure to improve their living conditions, to offer them a decent quality of life. But the implication of that could be for more emissions. And this leads to the debate of how can we then address climate change concerns? How can we meet net zero targets? And if we look at the composition of breakdown of nations, you will see that predominantly the high emitters are in the global north and the low emitters are in the global south. If you were to put them on a map, you can very clearly distinctly see the divide where the per capita, so the per person emissions, is lower in the global south. But that by itself is not the full picture, because those are the pockets, the locations which will have lower GDP and incomes. Those are the locations and pockets which are most vulnerable to climate change and have a higher risk. So whether it's South Africa, whether it's India, Bangladesh, or Kenya. So even though populations there emit less, they suffer the most or bear the burden of climate change related impacts. And within that, you'll see that a large proportion of population lives in what we call slums, informal settlements, so communities with very poor environmental conditions, infrastructure, and housing stock. So now, in effect, you've got people who consume very little, contribute very little to the climate change, but really are really suffer from the adverse impacts. And within that subgroup, it is women who suffer the most because they are the ones who take responsibility, leadership for meeting infrastructure needs of households. And I've worked extensively in the settings of slums, informal settlements. And if you were to take any city, I mean, this is an example of a city in India, but if you were to take cities and map out where the slums are located, you'll find that predominantly slums are located near water bodies and natural drainage paths, which in a way makes sense because a lot of those locations are close to water bodies. It provides easy access to water, means of disposing waste, which are easy, and quite often the land along drainage paths and rivers, they belong to governments, very little kind of real estate development. So it makes sense intuitively that those pockets are located near drainage paths, but in a way that is also problematic because those pockets therefore are more vulnerable to climate-related events, especially events such as flooding. So you have the situation where residents, especially women, who are already struggling in their day-to-day lives to access infrastructure, are then subject to the adverse impacts of climate change. And if we dig a bit deeper into those day-to-day lived experiences, women are the ones who spend time collecting water. So they, on an average, spend an hour or 2 hours a day collecting water. In my work in India, I asked 100 households in 5 slums in India, what would the women do if they saved the time on water collection? And the responses ranged from housework to income generation, childcare, education, and leisure. And this has a huge implication on quality of life and progression and growth, because if this time is freed up for women, they can use it, especially for sending children to school, improving educational outcomes. What is more problematic, though, is the lack of sanitation services. And in settings where women are dependent on public toilets, it's simply not a convenient solution at times. There's a lack of safety, lack of dignity, inconvenient fights, bad health, the toilets are not maintained. And on top of that, if there's flooding, it's extremely hard to access those facilities, very basic facilities. So you have this setting in the global south where everyone is fighting for basic infrastructure and everyone is fighting for survival, but you have a subgroup which is most adversely impacted. This is a study we did in Mumbai in Dharavi slum, where we asked respondents, and this was a study which is really focused on different typologies of public toilets and women's day-to-day lived experiences of using those facilities. And as you can see, and this was a study in 2 different settlements, Dharavi and Nehru Nagar in Mumbai. And as you can see that women were subject to violence, whether it was eve teasing or assault or robbery or rape. So there are other added layers or barriers to accessing very basic services in those settings. In terms of mitigation measures, some of the measures were kind of more physical or engineering oriented measures, such as providing better access routes and lighting and better cleaning of toilets. But of course, in order to address some of those solutions, you need to think about kind of climate and climate resilient solutions. If we move into the field of electricity and clean cooking, this is an area which is extremely challenging, and we work with remote rural communities in sub-Saharan Africa, where we're trying to understand how people use electricity and clean cooking solutions. And we are finding that progression to clean energy, so clean energy transition pathways are not straightforward. In reality, households practice fuel stacking, where they use a combination of clean and polluting fuels. There's this assumption that if you provide clean tech, there's going to be this linear upward progression. But depending on financial circumstances and shocks and stresses to the systems, we find that quite often households move down this ladder to using more polluting fuels. Examples include COVID, where due to loss of jobs, households did not have disposable income and they moved back to using polluting fuels like wood, which has an implication in terms of time burden for women, but also exposure to indoor air pollution. So in effect, the assumption that clean technology by itself is going to address the climate agenda is therefore not valid. You need a combination of technical approaches, but also social influencing social cultural barriers to address the climate agenda. And infrastructure is a very powerful tool or weapon here, because what infrastructure does, it shifts needs and aspirations. So in this graph, the blue line shows community needs and aspirations before they had access to basic infrastructure, and the red line shows aspirations and needs after they had access to basic infrastructure services. So in effect, what infrastructure does, it shifts communities from survival for fighting for basic needs to thinking about higher order needs and aspirations, which lead to improvement in quality of life. So infrastructure can act as a lever to do so. And infrastructure opens up opportunities for improving environment, improving housing stock and living conditions, which is required for addressing climate change agenda, because we want communities to have good quality of life, but do it in a way where we have solutions which are climate friendly. And what we found in our work in India is communities invested around $2,000 to $3,000 to improve their housing stock on the back of infrastructure improvements. And the motivation predominantly for this investment was better infrastructure. And what happens is, as a result of this, there's kind of empowerment, there's dignity, there's access to opportunities and opportunities for everyone to be engaged in the city. And a lot of work we do is evidencing why infrastructure is important for meeting sustainable development goals. And we do very structured reviews. For instance, we, the group of colleagues, an interdisciplinary team at University College London, we reviewed over 600 publications to demonstrate that sanitation is non-negotiable to address the sustainable development goals. So if you take action in sanitation, it benefits 130 out of the 169 targets, and it includes all 17 goals, including climate, partnerships, equity, health, well-being, poverty, education. And particularly for climate change, it is important to kind of leverage those benefits and synergies, because what good sanitation solutions can do is to safeguard water systems, to protect the environment, to reduce transmission of disease, contamination, and foster kind of climate adaptation interventions and solutions. Bearing in mind that the solutions we provide, as designers, we need to consider the trade-offs. So it could be that we provide flush toilets and more flush toilets, but the implication of that could be that we are using more water in water scarce areas. And that's really the intersection with climate change, where if you have water scarcity, what type of infrastructure solutions can you provide to benefit all, and in particular, women? We're currently working with UNICEF on articulating the implications of climate for children, but also looking at the gender dimension of climate change. And there are multiple examples, and I presented you here, where the impact of climate change would be an increase in disease. And the gender dimension here is a majority of women act as caregivers or frontline workers, or quite often women lack access to healthcare services. Water scarcity, the big implication is women have to walk longer distances, and there's a time burden for women. In terms of water quality, there's higher levels of exposure for women, especially if they are the ones collecting water. Extreme weather events such as flood especially means there could be some gender norms around this, or lack of ability of women to swim and to evacuate safely or go out alone. So there could be a range of gender norms here which influence behaviors and choices. When rural communities migrate to cities, it is the women who are more vulnerable to violence, harassment, and loss of privacy. In agricultural sector, we see feminization of agriculture, for example. So when it comes to income generation, women are the ones often who are most adversely affected. And similarly, when it comes to nutrition and stunting, it is women and the girl child who are more adversely affected. But overall, a lack of infrastructure with the intersection of climate-related impacts means there's an increased time burden, especially for women, and anxiety and stress for women and girls. I want to conclude with this visual because this shows that there's still a lot of work to be done around improving living conditions, providing access to very basic services, whether it's water, whether it's sanitation, whether it's electricity or clean cooking fuels. And for that, we will need to think of climate adaptation plans, which are well resourced and which respond to needs of those communities, and in particular, women and the girl child. But in doing so, it's interesting being part of COP because I could see that there's kind of this tension between the need and aspiration to very quickly reach net zero targets on one hand, and the need and demand for more investment in improving quality of life. So this is the image I would like to leave you with, and kind of this conflict between developing and developing nations on climate justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priti. And potentially, again, a lot of questions arising from that very expansive discussion of the lack of infrastructure and the impact of climate change. Folks, do remember Slido is there to take your questions. We can pick up after our final speaker, which is, she is Jordana Ramalho, and she will explore the centrality of home and housing to women's experiences of climate change. So over to you, Jordana.
Thanks very much, Karen. And thank you to the first two speakers. So I think actually a lot of what I'm going to be speaking about today is going to summarize and kind of reconfirm a lot of what both Virginie and Priti have mentioned. And actually, before I kind of jump into the significance of home and housing, when I was thinking about this, actually, I was really thinking like, what are the impacts? Like, why is it that women are more vulnerable or more at risk from global warming? And I think the first thing that kind of jumped out at me was kind of thinking more about women's role in agricultural production. And this is something that both Virginie and Priti have mentioned in their slides. And I just wanted to drill down a little bit more on that because I think it's quite important. And then I'll move into my arguments around other aspects of labor and how labor is connected to the home and how this in turn affects sociospatial vulnerabilities of women and girls in particular. So in terms of women's dependence and involvement on small-scale agriculture, so around the world, women are actually, they constitute the majority of small-scale producers. And it's estimated that they make up, pardon me, between 60 and 80% of the agricultural workforce in sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. And although the majority of women involved in small-scale subsistence agriculture is kind of, their activities are geared very much towards meeting household consumption needs. Small-scale farming actually accounts for 80% of global food production. So we're talking like the majority of food production is being delivered by these women. And they're doing this predominantly, as I said, for consumption, but also they'll be able to sell whatever's left at local markets. And we know that agriculture is greatly affected by global warming and related heat waves, droughts, flooding, rising levels of pests, and yield-reducing diseases, especially, I would say, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where it's estimated that only 4% of land is actually irrigated. And I think both Priti and Virginie gave some really nice examples and went into a bit more detail on that. So I'll skip over that part of my presentation. It's also worth noting that despite women's key role in global food production, women and girls are much more likely to go hungry than their male counterparts. And again, Priti mentioned this in some of her slides. And there's very dramatic evidence, actually, unfortunate evidence that gender gaps in food security have actually widened quite significantly over the course of the pandemic. And so what this tells us is that in moments of crisis, it's women and girls that fare the least well. And this is again connected back to gendered inequalities and power relations, and also the norms that kind of define who has access to resources within the household. But also beyond that, also just thinking about how these norms affect and these power relations affect women's access to and control over land, how this restricts their inheritance rights, their access to credit, and also to income generating opportunities more generally. So yeah, I wanted to share this thought because I think first and foremost, I think the impact of climate change on agricultural productivity, which we're seeing everywhere, and specifically women's reliance on this sector for their everyday sustenance, but also as a source of income, makes, I think this is a really key reason why I would argue women and girls are more affected by global warming than men and boys. The second part of my argument, I want to kind of turn more to feminized responsibilities for social reproductive care work. And again, Priti kind of talked about that quite extensively. So I'm not gonna repeat where I can, I'm gonna jump over that. But just to talk through what we mean by social reproductive care work. So I'm talking about the labors that are connected with meeting your household's immediate needs and maintaining life and survival, both on a daily basis and into the future, you know? So this includes, as Virginie mentioned, not just physical labors, but also emotional labors associated with feeding or clothing your family, as well as caring for children, for the elderly, the sick, and for communities more generally. And this is where the home becomes really fundamental to thinking through gendered vulnerabilities and exposures to various types of environmental risk connected with global warming. And again, thinking about divisions of labor, as Priti has gone into extensive detail, many of these reproductive tasks are intimately dependent on water and wood and other kind of fuel sources, which we know are affected by global warming in the same way that agriculture is. So just to kind of add a bit more context to what Priti has already said in the context of India. So I wanted to draw your attention to a survey that was conducted across 45 developing countries, which found that women and children carried the primary responsibility for water collection in 76% of the households surveyed, and were required to walk an average of 3.7 miles per day to collect water. In sub-Saharan Africa, one round trip to collect water took them an average of 33 minutes in rural areas and 25 minutes in urban areas, which adds up and contributes to these time burdens that Priti was mentioning. And kind of linking now again to Virginie's presentation, you know, under circumstances of conflict or disaster, where wash and other basic infrastructure may have been damaged or just not available, these trips take considerably larger amount of time, right? So there's a huge time burden, you know, emotional burden that's connected with these infrastructural deficiencies, water in particular. The lack of affordable and accessible water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure is also associated with heightened exposure to gender-based violence. Again, both Virginie and Priti have gone into detail on this, so I won't go into it myself. But I think just to kind of sum this up, it is women and girls more than men and boys that are really bearing the brunt of the burden for these infrastructural deficiencies, and especially for deficiencies that are connected to water. And water is intimately affected by global warming. So hopefully that's a key takeaway that you'll take from this, this discussion. The other aspect of social reproductive care work that I think is important to acknowledge is women's involvement in what I would term invisible labors of disaster risk management and resilience building. And this is especially so in the context of informal settlements. My research in the Philippines in informal settlements that were considered danger zones because they were greatly affected by fires, floods, and so on, found that it was women more than men who took on responsibility for waste management activities, so cleaning up where state services weren't available or kind of didn't meet the needs of the local community. This affects flood management. It also affects incidents of dengue, malaria, and so on. But women are also really actively involved in community organizing activities that kind of push back against state a lack of state accountability, shall we say. And this is not just in the Philippines, but everywhere in the world you see women very much at the helm of community organizing activities and advocacy initiatives that are pushing for improvements, particularly in informal settlements. So there's a number of different dimensions to gendered labor that I think, when you're in a moment of crisis, it's women who are carrying a lot of these deficiencies. And lastly, I wanted to focus in a little bit more on the sociospatial health implications of gender roles and divisions of labor, specifically in the context of urban poverty and informal settlements. And again, this is going to be in many ways a reiteration of what you've already heard. But I think key thing is like the significance of the home for women and for their social identities, and gender norms that make them more likely to be restricted to the home environment, less able to travel out. And this is particularly common in some contexts more than others. But by and large, women and children more than men are likely to be within the home environment. And that means that the various environmental and health hazards connected with informal settlements, which we've already discussed, they're going to be much more exposed to them. And if we combine that with socioeconomic forms of discrimination, and what this means is that they're less likely potentially to be able to adapt or to find ways around that. I also wanted to touch on the fact that informal settlements, because of overcrowded conditions and some of the materials that are being used to construct homes in these neighborhoods, can create heat islands. And what that is, it basically means that like the temperatures within certain parts of a settlement can be as much as 7 to 10 degrees higher than areas outside of that. And I know Virginie said that there's a lot of differing opinions on this, but I think, if we think about many contexts where, the temperatures are already tropical and 50 plus degrees in cities, and then you add another 10 degrees onto that, and you think about gender divisions of labor and restrictions on mobility, which means that women are probably going to be more confined than others to these spaces. There are huge health implications there. And if we add open fires to the mix, for example, or stoves, and again, who tends to be kind of behind those stoves? It's women and girls. I think, the point's quite clear, that there are key health implications there, not just connected with heat, but also with air pollution, which is recognized as one of the main sort of silent killers of women and girls in developing country contexts. So a few concluding points, I think, to try to tie all three of our discussions together in many ways. I think, when we think about global warming, climate change, and the vulnerabilities and opportunities connected with that, I think it's really, really important that we approach risk not as like independent events, but as a continuum, ranging from kind of these extreme events to more slow onset and invisible hazards that that different people are exposed to on the basis of social identities, social norms, mobilities, the housing conditions that they're in, the livelihoods that they engage in, so on and so forth. I also think that we need to really recognize the interdependence between risk and infrastructure, a point that Priti made beautifully, so I don't need to harp on about that, but also the links between risk, infrastructure, and social reproduction, and how all of these are really intimately connected to relations of oppression, dispossession, and environmental degradation, which are in turn not only gendered, but also racialized, classed, and co-constitutive of one another. And I think these are points that each of the presentations have reinforced. So on that note, I will leave it there, and look forward to some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jordana. So we have had 3 really rich presentations. I remind you again, submit questions via Slido, sli.do, followed by the event code #UCLClimate. And let me go straight to the first question that came up. How can we make women's invisible work related to disaster risk reduction more visible and recognized by policymakers and planners? Does anybody want to pick that up?
I think that's a really great question, and it's something that I try to reflect on a lot. And I think it comes down the way that I've seen it, and the way I've tried to address it in my own research, is through the kinds of methods that we use. And I mean this both from a research perspective, but also a practitioner perspective. So recognizing that invisibility is closely connected with the biases that we hold as individuals and our positionality in terms of what we see in the so-called field or what we see in front of us, right? And so I think one way that we can render these invisible labors visible is to engage with individuals in a way that makes it perhaps more easy for them to tell us their stories, to showcase, you know, what they are doing, how they're affected by different events or situations. And so thinking through the politics of knowledge production to make the bodies and the infrastructures that are carrying these burdens kind of come to the fore, rather than thinking a lot about the more technocratic approaches.
Thank you. Virginie, do you want to add anything to that?
Just to add to Jordana's point is to say that in the methods that we use, the focus should be always to disaggregate the data that is collected by gender, by age, by ethnicity, etc. And there are lots of guidelines that already tell academics how to do this, or practitioners how to do this. But it's not just collecting this disaggregated data, it's then to analyze it with a gender perspective, otherwise it's meaningless. And that's where often the information is missing. So it means constantly, systematically asking who is telling this story, who is reporting this experience, and being mindful of who has a voice and who doesn't. This is what the perspective of a gender analysis aims to do, and that's something that we all ought to do, regardless of the sector and discipline that we work in.
Priti, do you want to add anything?
Yes, very briefly. So I think disaggregated data is excellent. I think I would take it a step ahead to say we need to better evidence the quantum of invisible work and the implication that has for health, education, and outcomes. So if we are able to develop this evidence base better to bring to policymakers, I hope that would shift kind of the thinking and approaches that we have.
So in a way that takes me to the next question, which is, does gender need to be at the forefront of any attempts to tackle climate change? And what needs to change to prioritize gender inequalities in the whole climate discussion? Priti, would you like to pick up on that for a start?
Yes, so I think, and as an engineer, we come across a lot of examples where, and I can give you some examples which are well known, where you're testing cars, but when you're testing cars, you're testing them on dummies which are 6 foot tall. So you find that in events of accidents, women are most at risk. So basically, in engineering as designers, we have a lot of discussions around having more inclusive and diverse teams when it comes to design and planning interventions, so that when we co-create those solutions and when we test those solutions, we have those diverse perspectives and diverse day-to-day lived experiences which come to the fore. Especially, for example, in infrastructure design, the experiences of using different types of cook stoves will be different depending on where you are and what type of layouts you have and what heights the cook stoves are set at, etc. So I think it's really having those diverse teams at the outset to plan and design interventions and solutions.
Great. And Virginie, you made a strong point that that risk is very much linked to occupations and gender roles. With that in mind, do you also think that gender needs to be at the forefront to tackle climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. And in 2 ways. First, and I think that was very well articulated by Jordana, is this focus on health and social reproduction and health occupational role is a way to understand those invisible roles and contribution to household well-being. And when we compare the health sector or public health compared to other sectors, who benefits from public funding? It's never public health. It's always big infrastructure, fossil fuel subsidies, and the rest of them. So the intention on health is a way to bring back gender equality or inequalities and make them visible. But the other aspect where gender is a powerful lens is to look at who make decisions about and sustainable development pathways, is to look at who are the world leaders, what type of decisions do they make about the use of public resources, to look at who are the negotiators of different COP each year. Each year, we show that there is a lack of parity in who is making decisions. And this lack of parity is really important because there's evidence that suggests that in some countries where there are more women parliamentarians, there are better laws for the environment, to protect the environment. So it matters a huge amount to consider gender equality.
Thank you very much. Jordana, is there anything you'd like to pick up here before I move on?
Not particularly, just to say that, like, I think it's not just about gender, but it's about that, like, a feminist lens, or a lens, if you're not comfortable with the term feminism. I imagine most people on this call are, but like for those who might not be or are trying to sell it, it's about being able, it's a way or a set of methods and theories that enable us to unpack power relations, whether that's at the geopolitical scale that Virginie just mentioned, or at the scale of the household and the everyday kind of interactions of people with their environment, with infrastructure. And I think that focus on power inequalities is absolutely fundamental to a more kind of just, sustainable future connected with climate adaptation.
Thank you. We have a more specific question now. Does climate change impact women more so than men here in the UK, as well as in the global South? Does anybody want to pick that up specifically? Anybody have any data on that?
I don't have data from the UK, but I can share evidence from Sweden, where during an episode of very cold weather and snowstorms, the public authorities of a particular city, I can't remember the name, noticed that there were more accidents from affecting women. And the reason is because more women were taking their kids to school by walk. And therefore, and when the city were cleaning roads from snow, they were focusing on the roads, but not on the pavements. And so the pavement became a huge source of hazards for pedestrians who were in majority women. So that was a very interesting perspective from the so-called global north on how some people might be infected differently by the same hazard.
And again, I think that links to the gender roles and relations, which dictate, the patterns by which people live, both in time and space, which then have implications, obviously, for the impact of climate change. Priti, did you want to come in here?
Yes. So, I mean, whilst I have focused quite extensively on global South and slums, but the harsh reality is in UK, we also have challenges around poverty and homelessness. And within the subgroups, due to poor housing and infrastructure and environmental conditions, you'll find there'll be disparities over kind of the burden of work, the burden of household activities and roles, and those who are most adversely affected. And once again, it's going to be the women who are most adversely affected.
A general question here, has the pandemic exacerbated these climate change inequalities in any way? Could I just call on one of you to take that, and maybe we can cover one or two more questions before we close. Anybody have a view on whether the pandemic has exacerbated?
I would say that it has, based on, I think thinking of many of the people that I'm in contact with in the Philippines, who I was in contact with over the course of the pandemic, I know that with any kind of care work, and particularly when it's relating to health and well-being, women, because of everything that we've just discussed, are the ones who find their responsibilities heightened. And then when you add a kind of a lockdown into the mix, and again, thinking of the many people that are living in communities where access to basic infrastructure is limited, your ability to wash your hands or to access water, soap, all these things is greatly inhibited. And again, when we think about gendered roles and divisions of labor, who does that affect more? It's women. And when people get sick, who does that affect more? It's women and girls, right? So the pandemic, like any crisis, has exacerbated many of the challenges connected with, I would argue, with reproductive labors.
So we've talked a lot about these, obviously, with gender inequalities and the link to disaster, but under what conditions, a question here, under what conditions might a disaster allow for challenges to gender inequalities? Does anybody want to pick that up as the final question?
Thank you for that question. I've tried to grapple with it a few years ago to try and understand if disaster could become those windows of opportunity, to quote others who termed this. And it was actually difficult to find evidence that it does, because often opposite, it reinforces social norms that confine women to certain roles and spaces, and it re-emphasized discrimination against women, girls, and gender minorities. And the reason it does so, it's because it aggravates stresses that alter the functioning of, or the so-called normal functioning of societies. So at the same time, my research in Chad shows that with the intervention of humanitarian actors, actually new services can become available in places where they were not existing before. I'm thinking about protection services for women victims of abuse, medical services, legal services to provide justice. This can be brought in because of the response to disaster, not by the disaster itself.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank all three speakers. Unfortunately, we have a couple more questions there, and I know that the conversation could probably go on all afternoon, but unfortunately, we only have a couple of minutes left, in which I'd like to thank all three of our speakers today for raising such important and very, very rich discussions and debates. Thank you so much. And really, I think, generating a lot of questions and a demonstration of the really interesting work that's going on here at UCL. I'd also like, just before we close, to mention that the next lunch hour lecture will take place on Thursday, the 9th of December. The topic will be Towards Net Zero, life cycle assessment as a decision-making tool for low carbon solutions. And again, this is a lunchtime session from 1 to 2, so do join that. And we look forward to seeing you again. So thank you again to our speakers for today. Thank you to the audience and for your very interesting questions. And take care, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye all.